Hi, it's Stephen here for Bland Designs, and this is my next episode in my new series, The Idiot Quilter, and I am the Idiot Quilter. And so I thought I'd take you on a little quilt show of what I've created over the last 3 months. I didn't really get into quilting until I did this piece, and this was actually a piece that was inspired by material from Cricut. I have a Cricut maker and it has a rotary cutter on it, and so I thought I'd see just how well it could cut material. So I had their material, I cut it out. I cut out the butterflies from some material as well using the Cricut maker, and I sewed this together. Now, I didn't know what I was doing. I was just sewing squares of material together. So things are a little uneven, not matched up. I did it on my old sewing machine, my brother, which when I say old was relatively new to me because I bought it new about a year before at Costco. For 187 bucks, it was a good deal. And not knowing anything about sewing machines, I figured, well, that was a good way to get started. But I wasn't really into the quilting mode. The binding that's on this, I made that up and I glued some fibers to it. And yeah, it's a wall hanging. There isn't any real quilting in this. I may have done stitch in the ditch. Oh, I did. I tried to. I must have looked that up on YouTube. And I added some little stitching between the butterflies to give the effect of, you know, them flying. And I added some jewels, some little plastic bling. I glued those on. When I made this, I was more in the art journaling mode, you know, doing layers, adding things together. I wasn't really trying to make a quilt, but this got me started. So I'm going to take you over and show you my progression of my quilts to date. So this was my first real quilt, and I made this from a kit. And the way I discovered this and got started into it was, now that I had my sewing machine, I had done that first piece, I decided to watch some YouTube videos about quilting, and it got me really going, got my interest going. And so I looked up quilting stores, sewing stores in my area, and I was surprised to find a couple. So I went to one of them, checked it out, bought a few things, and then I went to the other one and I saw this quilt on display, and I thought I really liked the colors and everything. And I asked the lady about classes and that, and she does do a class with this particular quilt, but it's a kit. And so I said to her, well, do you think if I didn't take the class, that it came with a booklet, that I'd be able to follow the instructions? And she said, yeah, you probably would be able to. And it's basically a type of sampler quilt where it's got different types of blocks in it, the standard blocks that are, you know, part of the tradition of quilting. And so I put it together. Now, you have to remember at this point, I had not taken a class. I'd only watched YouTube videos and I was following the instructions in the booklet. So there are flaws, but I was sort of impressed with how it all came together. I quite liked it. And if you want to see the backing material, this is what the backing material looks like as well. I didn't know at the time, but I do now, that all of this material, this fabric, was designed by a man named Cafe Facet, which in the quilting world and in the knitting world, he's very famous for his textile products and his designs. And I did love the colors of the material. Now I had problems. I had to learn how to bind it. Binding isn't difficult, but there are some tricks, and so there are flaws in this. But overall, I was kind of impressed, and it was with that I got hooked. So I moved on to my second quilt. Now, here's the problem. This quilt was not a kit. This was not from a pattern. I decided to break out on my own and design my own quilt from scraps of material that I had laying around. So that's what I did. Now, at first glance, this one doesn't look too bad. Color choices and things like that could have been better, but this is what I called an epic fail. There are so many mistakes in this, so many flaws. I had problems with the binding. I tried to do a little embroidery on those white strips that are there with my machine. Actually, they turned out not too bad, but I really didn't have a clue. This one, although I'm not disappointed in it completely, I just remember the frustration I had with it in comparison to the first one. But I'm one of those kind of people, I don't like to follow the rules. And my idea of quilting is to get into art quilts, improvisational quilting. But for my second effort, it's not too bad until you get a really close look at it. And I'm not going to spend time pointing out my mistakes in this one. Now this is quilt number 3. And again, it's my own design, but this is all made up of tea towels that have been cut into strips and squares and sewn together. This is a commemorative quilt because I had gone to Australia for 5 weeks and I collected tea towels. And my idea was to put all the tea towels together as a memory of the trip, and that's what I did. Now, working with tea towels, they tend to be a little heavier than the cotton fabric I was using on my other 2 quilts, so they're a little tougher to sew together. And of course, I had to figure out the patterning and the placement of everything. This is a much larger quilt, because that's what it ended up being like, and I'm really happy with the way it turned out. Now on this one, I actually did some quilting, but I did walking foot quilting, and so there are lines in this. Get up closer and you can see them, and they're not particularly that straight. I did try to do on purpose some curvy lines in the border, but as you can see, they're not consistent. The binding, I blew it when it came to joining, and my stitching around it is very uneven, and I have learned since then, and as I move to my next quilt, my 4th quilt, and this is my best quilt to date, and this came from the class. I learned some tips about binding properly, and I realized I was doing it wrong. I've done some quilting on this one too, again with a walking foot, but instead of stitching the ditch, I went around 1/4 inch, and for the most part, they're fairly straight. They could be better, but again, in terms of my evolution as a quilt maker, this one is my best one to date. And I was really pleased with how that turned out. Now that was from a class, and I'm going to take more classes with that. The backing on these, well, the one from Australia is pieced with really wonderful colors of tea towels. And this one's got a real funky, colorful, psychedelic backing to it as well, which I also used the same material for the binding in this one's case. And I just love it. I think this one is my best. But when I made this one, I had extra pieces left over because I cut too many of the squares. Those are half square triangles, which those of you that are quilters know what I'm talking about. I had enough left over to make another quilt, so I'm going to show you the quilt top that I made from the leftovers of this one. Now this is not a finished quilt, this is just the quilt top, but this was made up of all the leftover half square triangles that I had from the quilt I just showed you. And so you see I had quite a few left over. And I decided to add the sashing in between and as a border. Again, I have never done sashing before, but YouTube's a wonderful place and figured out how to do that. This one I'm very proud of as well. Now it needs to be layered and it needs to be quilted. And I'm not sure how I'm going to do the quilting at the moment. I might just do something simple with the walking foot. I might attempt to do free motion quilting, but I don't want to blow it on this one. And I've been practicing some free motion quilting, as you know, in the first episode of the Idiot Quilter, and I'm not too good at it yet. So I'll need a little bit more practice. So I'll have to figure this out. So this quilt's going to be on hold for a little while. I may actually layer it today, but as far as the quilting part and completing it, it may take me a little time until I get comfortable with free motion quilting, or I figure out what kind of quilting I want to do on this. My latest project is another experiment. This is where I take strips of my scraps, and there's a pile of them over there, and you lay them down on a piece of like tissue paper. I'm actually using deli paper, and you start in the center, you lay out a strip, and then you start sewing on either side of it more strips. When you get it done, you peel the paper off at the back. It's all perforated from your needle, and you have a perfect square. So I'm going to make more of these today, and then I'm going to decide how I'll put them together as a quilt. Now you see, you're not concerned in this kind of thing with your strips lining up, and you can change these around to whatever you want, whatever you think is pleasing. Now right now I'm thinking of trying to do some of these in wonky format. Instead of them all being straight pieces, maybe some with a bit of a slight curve or a wave. I don't know. It's all part of the experimentation. But you can see this is going to make a really colorful quilt when I get it done. So anyways, oh, and one last thing. Speaking of scraps, this is my scrappy bag. This is a quilted tote bag that I designed using scraps. You'll notice that some of these scraps look very familiar because they were in my very first quilt, the one that came in the kit. So I made a bag out of it as well. So I'm really having a lot of fun with this quilting, and well, I thought I'd just share my little mini quilt show with you. See you for the next Idiot Quilter show. Bye for now.